So I felt like there's been this perception kind of for a while now that 2022 was kind of a bad, empty year for games, but I kind of never really agreed with that. And I feel like the best way to prove that, instead of just like listing games that come out or something, is kind of talking about why I think that perception has kind of happened, and kind of arguing that that's wrong. Because there's the kind of idea of it was basically just Elden Ring and nothing else, which isn't really that accurate, but a lot of the games were kind of niche, right? Like in terms of just big mainstream successes, you basically just had Elden Ring, God of War did pretty well, and like that year's Call of Duty was kind of above average in terms of like reviews and sales. But everything else was kind of more just appeals to people of like specific genres, right? Like MMOs had a pretty decent amount going on, right? Like you had the Dragon expansion for WoW, and then Lich King for WoW Classic kind of later in the year, and then Lost Ark earlier on. And I think there was like New World updates were a thing too, if people kind of hung around for that. Like you were doing pretty okay if MMOs were kind of your main focus. Racing, sim, like console players had basically like the first game like that for a while. You know, like there was like the low player count like PC kind of hardcore ones, but in terms of just like console successful games, Gran Turismo 7 was basically the first one since like Forza Motorsports in like 2017. So that was pretty big. And there was also that Need for Speed one that had the whole unique, like weak framing. I think I mentioned in some other video the thing about how, oh, what's really the point in these racing games like Need for Speed when you can just do some races in Grand Theft Auto if you want. Like open world games have kind of swallowed up the driving games by just offering the same thing, but just like gameplay mechanics that kind of add extra context and meaning to races, like what that Need for Speed game did, were kind of an answer to that question. Strategy game players had like the Warhammer one, which was and still is not perfect, definitely has some issues, but for a while, when that first big update that added Immortal Empires that combined all the stuff from the first two games in just one big mode, that was a pretty good game for a while that kind of satisfied the very starved real-time strategy audience that doesn't really have too much happening besides Total War. There's a ton of like sim indie games, like Dwarf Fortress came out late in the year. There's like multiple ones about like running a cult, right? Like a bunch of stuff like that. There was one I played, I think at the very end of the year in beta, that was like running like chicken and like donut stores that were actually just a front for like a drug ring, basically. That was interesting. There's a lot of stuff with that, like sim indie game. And again, kind of by nature of what I'm saying, niches, there are probably some other stuff that I just literally didn't even know happened. But, catered to just some demographic that I'm just like not actively paying attention to. Plus, and exclusivity kind of played a role in all this too, because Sony had a pretty decent amount happening on their side. Like I mentioned God of War and like Gran Turismo 7 already, but they also had like Horizon's game and that remake of the first Last of Us. You throw in the third-party stuff, like I mentioned, like Elden Ring. That's a pretty solid year if you're like a, exclusively pay on like PlayStation. And a lot of the stuff I specifically mentioned was like on PC too. But if you only had like a Switch or an Xbox, I guess you kind of really didn't have that much. And yeah, 2022 was a pretty bad year for you. Like you had some small stuff, like Pentiment, Splatoon 3, that was good, but not like massively better than pre-existing Splatoon on Switch. This Kirby game was good, but not huge attention grabber. So if these were your only ways to play games, then yeah, it wasn't that good of a year for you, but I think in general, it kind of was. And that's kind of a contrast to 2007. Like that's the go-to like best year ever, just because you had so many games, but they were a lot more mainstream and a lot more like evenly distributed amongst the platforms, right? Because you had a ton of just multi-platform stuff like Call of Duty 4, BioShock, Orange Box, stuff like that. But then basically every platform had its own big exclusives, right? Like Xbox was probably the best. Yeah, Halo 3 and like Mass Effect and Forza. But then, Nintendo had like Super Mario Galaxy and like Metroid Prime 3. And then Sony, a little bit weaker, because this was still like the PS3's kind of suffer era. But you still had God of War 2 and Uncharted, which kind of wasn't in the same tier of like Halo 3 or like Super Mario Galaxy, but that was the game that basically like was the rough draft for the framework that Sony got a lot of success of with like cinematic adventure games over the next 15 years. So it's definitely not nothing. And then PC had a bunch of stuff like, the first Witcher game, Supreme Commander, Burning Crusade for WoW, when that was basically at its peak and like basically mainstream in a way. I feel like it's kind of died down a little now. Just again, a lot less niche and a lot more evenly distributed amongst all the platforms than it kind of was in 2022. There's also the weird thing, the conversation about games was kind of just like Elden Ring, but then also every game in relation to Elden Ring, right? Like God of War came out and it was great, but people kind of really talked about it like, oh yeah, this game's good, but it's probably gonna lose like Game of the Year award. Like, yeah, the first one won, and games journalism, whatever they gave it to like Last of Us Part 2, people are still annoyed at that, or at least just like don't trust them, I feel like I really just didn't hear that much of people like specifically talking about how great God of War Ragnarok was or why it was great, despite just how good the reception was and how it sold pretty well. And like the Horizon games, people are always just like, oh yeah, it's that game series that like the first one came out right for Breath of the Wild and people didn't care about it, and then the second one came out right before Elden Ring and people didn't really care about it. But that's kind of like not true at all. Like, it's kind of just completely wrong. Like those two games have sold like over 30 million copies combined. And if those are games that like no one cares about because they just got blown out by like bigger, better games immediately after, then something like the Gears of War series that took like 4 games to hit 20 million is just a figment of your imagination if, again, Horizon games are like irrelevant. But that kind of just resulted in, again, this idea that 2022 was basically just Elden Ring and like nothing else, basically, when that's really not what happened. And I kind of feel like a lot of that has to do with how the PC segment of games really has a lot of sway in how stuff is talked about. Because like you look at the big PC subreddit is way bigger than like the biggest console game subreddits. Right? It's just kind of how it works. Like PC gaming is just more connected with the conversation. Console players like play a game on their couch, then that's kind of it. Just go along with their lives. Don't really engage as much, except for maybe just like some posting on Twitter once in a while or whatever. Maybe not even posting, maybe just like liking stuff on Twitter, honestly, or Instagram or something. It's probably the limit for like a lot of people. That resulted in Elden Ring really being the thing a ton of people talked about and what like people made YouTube videos about. Like, this kind of didn't happen in like 2018, despite that being kind of very similar. Right? Like it had, Red Dead and then like 2 Sony exclusives with the first God of War and Spider-Man. And then 2022 was, Elden Ring, a multi-platform just like Red Dead. And then again, like 2 Sony exclusives, like Horizons and God of War, again. Like those are probably like the big 3 mainstream games of like both years, and like Call of Duties, I guess. But Red Dead didn't completely absorb the conversation, I feel like. And that's probably partially because it didn't have a PC port. That came like years later, so there was kind of this even playing field of like, oh, these games are all just kind of console games. Red Dead just kind of happened. The same way that like God of War Ragnarok just sort of happened, and Spider-Man just kind of happened. There are some exceptions, like Animal Crossing and Tears of the Kingdom had a decent amount of like social media presence, but that was mainly just because of the sort of user-generated content side of things. Like all those machines that you can make, which like general island customization. The most of the time they do just kind of happen and don't really get talked about because, again, the PC side of things just really creates a lot of that conversation. But, obviously those games still happened. Even if, in terms of memorability, they didn't gain the amount of just presence things like Elden Ring had. You think, if you actually just go through and actually think about all of these as they are, as their own game, it was a pretty solid year.